Cox.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, it's hard to generalise given the differing circumstances in each country, but that said, religious minorities have clearly suffered grievous oppression, often predating the so-called Arab Spring, in countries such as Egypt, Iran and Iraq, and indeed elsewhere. Egypt in particular has witnessed an upsurge in vicious sectarian violence, and we continue to urge the Egyptian authorities to establish conditions in which all discrimination on the basis of religion is prevented. We deplore all discrimination against religious minorities and all constraints on their freedom to practice their faiths.
My Lords, in thanking the Noble Lord the Minister for that reply, may I ask if you would agree that in these early days of the so-called Arab Spring, the impact on religious minorities has so far been favourable for the Jewish and Christian communities in Tunisia, but as he's already indicated, cause for deep concern in Egypt, where although the Baha'i community has so far been spared violence, the attacks against the Coptic Christians have been over 44 since January the 25th, and that a recent report by Amnesty International claims that discrimination and attacks against the Copts have actually increased since the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces took power. Now, I therefore ask the Noble Lord the Minister if, in addition to encouraging the Egyptian leadership to ensure religious freedom for all its religious minorities, they will also call to account those who are perpetrating the violence.
Well, the Noble Baroness is absolutely right in pointing to the violence in Egypt, a matter which, of course, must concern all those who believe in freedom of religious worship. We do continue to urge the Egyptian authorities on the prime importance of pluralist and non-sectarian policies. The Egyptians have brought in, or are moving towards bringing a new unified law, which is going to be even-handed, so we understand, between Copts and Muslims, and are also talking about an anti-discrimination law. As far as those who can be established as guilty of some of these nastier events, they certainly should be brought before the courts, but I think that is a matter for the Egyptian legal authorities.
How does the Noble Minister respond to critics like Anne Widdecombe, who say that there is a double standards on the part of the Prime Minister, in that, quite properly, we withdraw aid from Uganda because they discriminate against homosexuals, but do not use our aid policy against countries which manifestly do discriminate against Christians and other religious minorities?
Well, it's not quite correct that the sort of withdrawal of aid geared to particular attitudes on policies in the way that the Noble Lord has described. What is done is that support for governments through aid is brought into question where those governments are upholding policies which we clearly regard as highly undesirable and objectionable. It doesn't mean to say that aid does not continue through non-governmental agencies and directly as we can organise it to good development causes, good development projects, and indeed even support of private sector operations. These things can be done without having to uphold the views of governments. If the Noble Lord says it's double standards, I think one has to, in the real world, talk about selectivity. One has to make selections, one has to make choices, and some governments are clearly ones we want to support, some are ones which we have great reluctance to do anything to enhance or entrench.
My Lords, I'm very grateful to the Noble Lord for the insistence on the importance of constitutional guarantees and anti-discrimination measures, but I think he's begun to go there. Would he recognise the importance of remedying some of the institutional shortcomings which limit human development and social cohesion? I'm very aware of very high levels of economic disenfranchisement among some of the religious minorities throughout the Middle East, which risk really inflaming and adding to the fuel of a very volatile social mix in some of the poorest areas, particularly where religious communities live in close proximity to one another. And I wonder if he could say how such considerations are informing government policy towards the region.
Well, the Right Reverend Noble Prelate is correct that it's a whole nexus of undesirable social customs and pressures which create the bad conditions in which this kind of discrimination can occur. Our policies, such as our Arab partnership policy, do contain specific modules or elements which are designed to, for instance, support the rights and position of women, promote family law in every possible way and to challenge some of the highly coercive and highly illiberal practices of the past. There are difficulties, as a noble and right reverend prelate will appreciate, that we mustn't go around intruding heavily in the practices of other countries. Why should we do that? But certainly we must support and encourage the kind of practices which bring equality and decent values to countries where in the past darker customs have prevailed.
My Lords, would my noble friend agree would my noble friend tell the House whether they've had any consultations with these Middle East governments about reforming personal status laws so that the 14 million Christians who live in the Middle East might have access to divorce in civil courts if they so wish to do so, rather than having to convert to Islam or other religions?
Yes, those issues do come into our fairly constant dialogue and exchanges with the countries of the Middle East as they go through reform processes at varying speeds and in varying degrees. These are all the matters, the content of our exchanges in seeking to support and encourage the peaceful development, democratic and opening and liberalised development of these countries, which of course is directly in our own interest as a nation, great trading nation as well.
Is the noble Lord the Minister not concerned? My Lord. My Lords, I'm grateful. Does the noble Lord the Minister agree that there are very worrying parallels with the situation in Iraq and in Palestine, where large numbers of Christian minorities from the ancient churches have had to flee? Has he seen the figures published by the European Union of Human Rights Organisations that over 100,000 Coptic Christians have left the country since March this year? And I declare a non-financial interest as President of the UK Coptic Association. And in particular, a quotation from their director that Copts are not emigrating voluntarily. They're coerced into that by threats and intimidation of hard-line Salafists and lack of protection they're getting from the Egyptian regime.
Well, I have seen a range of figures. Whether I've seen the specific reports that the noble Lord refers to, I'm not so sure. But these are big figures and very worrying figures. I'm the first to agree. The noble Lord mentions Iraq, and although I think the Arab Spring doesn't particularly have operated in detriment to religious minorities in Iraq, there have been a number of targeted attacks on minority communities, Christian, Yazidi, Shabak and others, and these are worrying matters, and we are constantly raising these with the Baghdad government. As to the Egyptian comments, the Egyptian situation, I have already indicated our extreme concern and our continuing dialogue, and that will certainly continue.
Lord Sheldon.
My Lord, I beg leave to ask a question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lord.